Um, Andrew, I appreciate you sharing with me that YouTube link of Josh McDowell and Mike Winger about how to become a better YouTube apologist.
Oh,
Now,
did you watch that?
I watched it. Now,
Uh-huh.
I'm not trying to be a YouTube apologist by any means. I'm not necessarily even trying to grow my audience or likes or subscribes by any means. And like I said, I'm just trying to like catch up with friends, and this is the best way to do it. You know, being far away and being under a pandemic and everything. But I did click on two different links that were associated. I watched um Sean McDowell, right?
Mario Sean
Yeah,
McDowell.
I watched Sean McDowell's interview with his dad, Jack,
Oh, Josh.
regarding regarding the Ravi scandal. And
Uh-huh.
I
Like,
also watched Mike Winger's take, all two
good.
hours of it on
Uh-huh.
it. I don't know if you guys did, but
Um,
um
I watched the Josh McDowell interview on the
uh-huh.
Ravi stuff. I watched most of the Mike Winger stuff, but I knew most of the information he was going over. So
Right. And I did read the report too when it first came
yeah.
out, because I was subscribed to the RZIM newsletter. So when they first, shared the report, I did click on it and read the full report. And initially when talked about a long time ago about, these like, allegations initially when it first came out, and I remember my initial reaction was like, oh man, probably not Ravi, no way. But
Mm.
after the report, I was like, oh dang man, it's like a lot worse, than people expected, than I expected. um so we could talk about that, but initially, and I don't know if I'm being fair or if I'm being like weird by saying this, but I want to start off by saying just wanted to share, I really did not like Josh McDowell's take, or I
Oh,
just didn't like his style. I don't like, I know that he's very famous in the Christian circle and stuff, but I felt like Sean was trying to be the best, to be like, hey, but like, what about this? And trying to like package it in a very nice way. And then
yeah.
just, I felt like Josh McDowell was being like too, like, for a lack of a better description, like old school, or very like, I don't know. I don't even have the right words, but it just didn't leave a good feeling like with me, like listening to him speak on it. I'm just like, I don't know. You're a famous dude. You're probably super intellectual or intelligent, but I don't agree with you on a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Mike Winger, on the other hand, you know, he showed a lot of emotion. I'm like, okay, that's a little like much for me as a viewer. Not to like, belittle or minimize anything that he's like experiencing emotionally, but definitely but then after watching his emotional plea and his explanations or his takes on reading the report, it did like help me rethink, like, yeah, uh this was not just like a mistake, where like, let's say like he like had an affair or something, but this is like predatorial. And so like, man, I was like, man, that just sucks. So let's start there. Let's start with the easy stuff. I think you said you watched them, or just in general, like how you feel these days about everything that's been going on with regarding like the Ravi revelations.
Yeah. Well, there's so much stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Stuff I'm still processing. Like, I watched those. I watched a couple, one or two other videos. And I've been like keeping up like with like articles coming out like that are relevant. There's questions about RZIM too.
Mm,
Like RZIM Canada is shutting down.
right. I saw
RZIM
that.
England is separating. RZIM US has a lot of like changes they need to make. Um, but maybe we can just start with like the things you talked about there. Um, so on the Josh McDowell, yeah, I could definitely see where you're coming from on that. Very old school, and actually, that's kind of one of the things I liked about it. That it was old school because I was getting a lot of pretty similar perspectives from like a lot of the younger YouTube apologist generation. Now, here's one thing I'm happy about. which is uh, all the Christian apologists like that are like have somewhat of an audience. Like nobody's defending Ravi anymore, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
really glad about that. Everybody's realizing this is a tragedy. I still get some people though in the comments that are saying like, "Why attack him when he's not around to defend himself?" and like
Yeah.
still making these outrageous claims of like extremely high skepticism. Like I heard of one person saying like, "I'm not going to believe it until I actually get to see the pictures that are supposed to have been in the
Wow.
photo." I'm just
Wow.
like, is your faith in this man like that extreme? Like something
Mm.
is wrong.
Yeah.
And there's just a general concern. This goes political too, like of like some Christian culture, like their ability to put so much faith into a human being. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
anyway, at least all the lay level apologetics people like are like all against this. Like we should be like supporting the victims, and that should be our focus. And like we should have listened better and such. So I just, but like some of the questions that came out, I thought were interesting to me. Um, like I've talked about this with Hayoung on a few occasions. Like Sean McDowell was asking Josh McDowell, like, "Is it right that you should have a ministry named after you?" Like Robbie's
Yeah, I
ministry.
remember that part.
Yeah. And so one thing I didn't like about Josh McDowell's response is sometimes he would give a response that wasn't really his full response. He would
Uh-huh.
just say one thing. I'm like, how does that answer? And then he'll give his better response, like as he talked a little bit more. Um, but but like I thought it was interesting that he still is for okay with the idea of having like Josh McDowell Ministries because people like associate like with him like a certain like they built a certain trust, and so they can trust some of his books or some of his materials.
Yeah.
So I just found that interesting. Like he didn't seem as much against celebrity culture that I think a lot of people have been criticizing. um, and I think on the whole, I am against celebrity culture and evangelicalism. But I do think what Josh McDowell was saying, I like that he was creating space in our evangelical culture to have like still have like heroes or
Mm-hmm.
still have spokespeople or like people that are better known.
Yeah.
Like some of the anti-celebrity culture can be so strong that like, oh no, we shouldn't have any of that. I like how Josh McDowell's like still giving some space for that.
I see. To
Yeah,
piggyback on that,
sure.
so I actually those are like a couple of things that that really like made me think hard about.
Yeah,
So Sean McDowell's question to Josh about naming a ministry after yourself. So a couple of things in regards to that. Um, I didn't like his response. Yeah, I could appreciate him making space for it, but I didn't like his response because I felt like he deferred on that one. Like I understand his reasoning, like people associate like like his reputation and his trustworthiness with his name, but then ultimately I could be wrong. But what I heard was, um, so he could have not done it, but then the two other people that were either his senior or his mentors or whatnot, they wanted it, and so he was like he deferred to it because he trusts them. So I'm like, I didn't really like that response, because I felt like he was kind of like shifting like the onus on the other people.
yeah,
But then in contrast to generally what Mike Winger was saying, I think he either explicitly said this or I started thinking about it in response to what he said. But I was thinking about if a ministry, especially God's ministry, is very closely associated with a particular person, let's say Ravi Zacharias or Josh McDowell, and that fell. And then I think a lot of the questions, like in the comments, obviously, or just people that have in general, like, oh, but what about all the good that he did? Of bringing either people to Christ or bringing a newfound depth of knowledge to either apologetics or theology or just basic Bible knowledge or whatnot, whatever it may be. Then what to do with that? Um, and then I was kind of thinking, yes, they probably contributed it greatly, but then I also thought, man, we for me personally, I think, we may be upholding people, like human people, a little bit too high, a little bit too
Yeah,
much. Because if not Ravi, if not Josh McDowell, I think God could raise up anybody else
yeah,
to bring just as effective, just as powerful, just as um, great, ministries, for His kingdom. And so I
yeah,
think before I was like, oh man, but they did such a great job and stuff. But now I'm like, we're all vessels, we're all faults, we all have faults, and just as quickly we may be able to rise in in human upholding or whatnot, we quickly fall, and doesn't mean that God's work is dissipated in any way. And so I don't know, just like watching at least those two and just kind of processing, it made me think like, yeah, I don't really. I think Mike Winger said something like, if your salvation was dependent on this person versus Jesus, then
yeah.
there's issues, there's problems here. And so it made me think, at the very least, it made me think again about stuff. And I'm like, man, yeah, it's
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I think we're in pretty much agreement on that, and I think that um, let's see, yeah, people can focus too much on individuals. That's right. Um, yeah. Okay. So many things to share about. Another thing, just to agree with you about the Josh McDowell thing, is like when asked about like listening to women's testimony, and
uh-huh.
like Josh McDowell said, yeah, yeah, that's valuable. He says something like that, but then he moved into stories about like you told that story about like apparently uh, like people who are anti Josh McDowell would like try to set him up with a
Mm,
prostitute, or
yeah,
like even like have a woman planted in his room and stuff like
right.
that, and like where they're trying, and like I just seemed like that wasn't the place for that.
Mm,
Like I think it's good to mention, yeah, sometimes a woman will lie, but I think it's also good, better to like just focus on the fact that like most of them are not, and like the vast majority are not, and that's not the usual thing. But like telling that story, like it's like, oh yeah, women are like there might be some women or some groups that are trying to like set up some of these Christian apologists, but like I think the main message, and sure that's true. Okay, let's grant that, but the main message now should be, um, but on the whole, we should be listening and believing, and that was the mistake that was made, a very big mistake that was made, like with Lori Ann Thompson, like not listening to her,
yeah,
um, and that does is a big fault of RZIM's.
yeah,
Like you probably saw this in the report. Like RZIM had enough information um, to do the thing they were required to do an actual investigation, um, and they didn't. And and like Lori Ann Thompson and her husband were like hurt a lot. So
yeah.
anyway, that's another part where I like kind of agree with, or sorry, didn't really like what Josh McDowell had to say. Another thing you were pointing about, like the what about the good art Ravi Zacharias did? I think we can just say, yeah, he did do good, and I think even the Holy Spirit worked through it and blah blah blah. And I think that's true for our lives too. Sometimes we do good, sometimes we could do bad. Um, and yeah, and I think that Ravi Zacharias did like very, very, very bad things, and we should just note that's a life has an individual's life will have like very, very good acts and very, very bad acts. But I think one other stage in the reasoning would have been this for Ravi and his ministry. This connects with your point about God can raise up whomever he wants. It's very bad if a minister is saying, oh, I better hide the sin for the sake of my ministry. Um, I need to
Oh
keep
yeah.
God. Yeah, and that's where the thoughts about what about all the good he did. So if somebody's thinking, my ministry is doing so much good that if I let people know the bad I did, then that's going to hurt their faith. um,
No, no, no.
yeah, yeah. So you can imagine like Ravi even doing that sort of reasoning, where like in the fact in the long run it was worse off. And I think that's where it is good for people like for ministers. I don't think we need to like shout like every one of our sins, but like um, if it's something that is like negative in the ministry, then yeah, I think people need to that's where the celebrity culture has gone too far. That's where like the self-importance of me has gone too far. I think like um, after Robbie's first slip up, I know who knows where it was. Like that's when he should have been like, "Wow, I stepped too far. Like I need to pull back." Um,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
instead it kept going and going and unassuming building. Um,
Hmm. Sad to say, but just to clarify for anybody who may be listening, like there should never be a case of where a Christian leader or any person for that matter is too big to fail, where the all the good that they're doing outweighs like their sin enough to like even attempt to cover it up. No, like if it's wrong, it's wrong. Bring it to light, confess it, repent, and stuff like that. There's absolutely no ever reason for any sin to be excused. Kind of related. So I was initially shocked at the visual cue of when Mike Winger put all the Ravi books into his trash can. And so I kind of wavered initially on that basis. Like, what about all the good that he's done? Like his writings, like, maybe we could still learn from it. And then so like after a few moments though, I was thinking, yeah, like we don't need to like necessarily contribute like, furthermore into like his publishing or his writings or whatnot. It could be something that, sees us at this point in history. We could definitely take the lessons that we have from his writings, from his teachings or whatnot. But again, going forward, that just because let's say like we cease to like publish or read or learn from his material going forward, doesn't mean that there's nothing else that we could also learn from. And so I think that's kind of what I was getting at personally, where um, what about all the good that he's done? I think
like
that could remain past tense. I guess that's kind of what I was getting at for myself. Like it
yeah,
doesn't have to be like where we continue to learn from him.
yeah, yeah. There is a. I think that is an interesting question. I don't know if there's a blanket um, advice. Like as I got more into philosophy, I felt like his apologetic material wasn't actually that strong, especially in philosophy. But
Hmm.
but some of his stuff is good, and so yeah, I'm a little bit mixed on it. Like you read Lotus and the Cross, remember? Like it just has a nice introduce you to some of the like introductions and yeah,
Yeah,
but
I mean, I really appreciated him because of like the East meets West appeal. Definitely, he's a great speaker,
right, he's
orator.
a very good
You're
speaker.
right. Yeah, so he definitely had a profound effect on like my understanding of like theology and
Yeah,
apology and apologetics, I mean, and stuff
yeah.
like that.
Not very good with apologies.
Right, but nevertheless, like at least an introduction or a say or a an intro into it, since didn't really like think about it before.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so many people grew and got into apologetics sometimes starting from Ravi. Like, I mean, that's me too. Like, I might not be a philosophy professor today had it not been for Ravi Zacharias.
Yeah.
And actually, a lot of my good spiritual habits, even things related to like sexual sin and sexual temptation, are partly due to Ravi Zacharias. Like, and
Hmm.
like he would have this quote, like, "It's better to shun the bait than to struggle in the snare." You know, I remember him saying that. Yeah, like I wrote that one down. I was like, good, yeah,
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 yeah.
that's really good. And he would have he would have like a lot like I still I feel like some of the people talking about Robbie didn't really listen to him much.
Mm,
Like the people criticizing him. Like I think you and I like listened to him quite a bit.
yeah.
Like I remember his sermon on like Joseph like fleeing from Potiphar's wife.
Hmm.
He has a sermon on Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and how they were willing to like control their appetites, right? And
Mm,
how important it is to control your appetites when it had to do with eating the king's food.
hmm.
Um, and I think you've heard that sermon too, actually. Um, and so he had all these sermons about that. And so it's funny, toward later years, like I've actually benefited more from his preaching on these topics about sexual sin and purity and all these in relation to God, more than like apologetic stuff. So it's sad to me like that's where like he had his fall. Like Mike Weiner even read a quote from his book on romance, on Isaac Take Thee Rebecca,
Mm,
like about you know, if you're in a marriage, like, do you ever look at a woman and start thinking like, oh, like, you know, like, might she be a possibility? And he's like you shouldn't be thinking about that, blah blah blah. Like it's amazing like how hypocritical he was about
yeah.
so
Yeah, well, I mean, Solomon was a
yeah.
very wise man, but he had a lot of wives too. Towards
Yeah.
the end, right? Towards the end of his life, and um, yeah, I mean, so.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, to add on, so a lot of people are making the comparison between Ravi to David, who committed adultery with Bathsheba and had Uriah murdered. And then the response to that is normally, well, David did repent in the end. Um, and his wasn't like a serial sexual predation that went over years. Like, I'm more likely to believe David had a slip up, like with Bathsheba, and then like trying to get out of it out of desperation, he has one of his men killed, like in this moment. And like now it's still like very bad. So I don't want to just keep it only at the slip up. It's like he intentionally like Uriah even like sleeps at his door, right? And then like he's like put him in the middle of battle, like Joab, and get him killed. Like so that's pretty bad. But still, Ravi's was like over a period of years, like with many women, like I don't know, it seemed like a lot more. Now, what Hayoung brings up is I haven't heard anybody really comparing Ravi to Solomon, where Solomon's sin does go long, and he actually doesn't repent in the long run. He ends like his ministry, his kingdom, uh, like worshiping other idols, right, and following like these other wives and concubines. So um, I still don't even then I don't put him at Ravi's level. Like the sort of sexual predation Ravi did just is so much more sinister. I feel like than, but I guess Solomon was also disobeying like the first commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me," and that's pretty serious too. So yeah, I haven't seen that. Good point. I haven't seen that explored as well as much. But he's someone who didn't repent in the end. But we still read Proverbs. We still read well,
Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes. Yeah, I'm not sure if that was written by Solomon, but
Right.
yeah,
Coleth, but
yeah, right, that other name. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Yeah.
But
Do you have thoughts about that? The Solomon comparison?
I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be Solomon in particular. I think the point is whether, he was repentant or not. It doesn't matter like the volume of like, number of women that he had. I think it's more of a question of like, seemingly it seemed like he was unrepentant till the end. Ravi, I mean, Ravi. I don't know about Solomon. But like, so this kind of goes into like a different tangent too. Like, even if we're unrepentant, like on our deathbed or at our death, I don't think that, has, it changes things for our eternity with God. But I think it's sad that such a great influencer in Christianity would not even at the end of his life be, like repentant. When and then that also brings into the question, was anybody checking him? Because obviously it doesn't seem like anybody at RZIM was checking him.
Right.
He has a lot of like friends in like, powerful circles, but yeah. But I was actually curious to hear like Hayoung's take on everything. You briefly mentioned Solomon, but I don't know if you had like other thoughts and stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, just what you mentioned about like, what do we do with his publications and reading materials? I think, I still believe that God can work through those things, um, even though the author might have been a great big sinner. Um, and in the end, I mean, the scandal is kind of very shocking and hurtful to a lot of people. Um, but like we all have the potential to be that person. Um, I think because we're all sinners. Um, and I mean, he committed a lot of sins, but like we're not able to measure or like compare our sins to his like right at this moment. Um, now, um, so yeah, I think well, those are two thoughts, I guess. Like, at one, I think God can still work through his publications. That's just like my personal take. I think it is possible for God to intend a lot of good with the things that Ravi had said, um, and still um, think, yeah, and still like condemn the sins that he's committed against a lot of the women. Um, Now, what would be really bad is if we say, "Oh, but he was a Christian; he'll be forgiven at the end." Um, that may be true, but it's just like not appropriate. Um, and I mean, yeah, it very well may be true, and that's actually like what would be most bothersome, right? As a Christian, how would I explain this to my non-Christian friends, right? Like, do I think that Ravi was forgiven for his sins? I think that would take a lot of courage to say that, yeah, I think he was. Um, I think that's really hard for me to think about. Um, and I mean, there is like what people are talking about. I'm just hearing things through Andrew too. So, like, there are a lot of discussion about like what the Christian culture should be like. Um, but in the end, I feel like culture is made um, through like a series of relationships that we build. What kind of relationships we build on an individual basis. So I feel like Ravi's um, crimes would have been prevented even if there had been like one person keeping him accountable. Just like one person who's like checking up on him, um, that he's being vulnerable. I feel like that could have been done. So, like, I feel like before we talk about culture, I think we should like maybe refocus in on what kind of Christian relationships are we building with our um, church or friends, and is that friendship like the kind of friendship that's providing accountability, like practically, like for like me, because I'm always like trying to see like, okay, like what do I learn from it, and like what do I do now, is I mean it's kind of hard for me, I guess, like in terms of like sexual sins, it's just like me and Andrew. I probably can't go up to like another guy in church and say, "Hey, have you been committing sexual sins lately?" That'd be kind of awkward. Maybe I can do that with girls.
Yeah.
Girls have a lot of like, you know, sexual sins swept under the rug as well. Um, so yeah, on a personal level, it seems like something we can also take away.
If I may just comment, I don't know if you were differentiating, but I think accountability and culture can be equated, where culture as in like, it's kind of like your environment that has become the norm, at least like as a loose definition that I could use right now.
I see.
And if accountability is a part of that, that becomes your culture. So whether it be for Ravi or just any one person, individual, where my culture is to, surround myself with people who will keep me accountable. And that will be my culture that I, practice in. Um, but I think in terms of like forgiveness of sin versus accountability, I think ultimately all sins are forgiven because of, you know, the power of Jesus' death on the cross. But I do not agree with, you know, just because a person's sin was forgiven, me that you minimize the sin. I think that's where sometimes Christians can, you know, fall short, where, oh, they're forgiven, so like kind of what Andrew mentioned earlier, that we don't have to talk about it, you know, posthumously. We don't have to like mention it again. But like, no, like we have to like, you know, address like, hey, this was a wrong that was committed. You know, we can factually state that, you know, this person, you know, sinned in this regards. There needs to be, if there needs to be some kind of like consequence, then there should be, you know, after the fact. I think that's for not just him, but for every single person, that, you know, when I think we have to, um, not just sweepingly gloss over things that we can, you know, bring to light and say this is wrong or this needs to be corrected. Just because we're Christian doesn't mean that, oh, you know, that sin is forgiven, so we no longer have to address it, because there is impact, there is consequence. We don't want to continue to perpetuate something that is incorrect or wrong, and then make that cycle continue to grow and grow and become even a bigger issue, just by saying, oh, let's not address that anymore because it's in the past and it's something that's been forgiven. But um I believe, you know, that that is the case.
Yeah. On the accountability culture thing, I like how Hayoung was like bringing, okay, so what can we do as individuals, and we can develop our own like vulnerability. Like, in this is one of the things I agree with about Josh McDowell. Like, invite people to confront us. Like, let them know. So actually, after I heard that, I was like, Hayoung, I want you to feel free to confront me. You know, like, and we should like have that sort of mindset with people around us. And um, yeah, and I think one of the things I've heard is that like because of the Ravi stuff, a lot of churches and ministries are trying to be more open in these areas. So I think that's a positive thing. But I think each individual can do that. And I think in church culture, especially Korean church culture, where the pastor can have a lot of power or like be kind of above, you know, the rest of the congregation. I think that should be a little bit like brought a little more closer together. So like um, I think pastors should do a little bit more of with certain maybe more mature members, like sharing of what their sexual temptations, lusts are, like and select people. And I think that should become part of the culture in the sense of like that becomes normal. So like I've been part of Christian ministry groups where like it becomes normal for like among my intervarsity, I was part of like a staff intern, but it became normal that amongst that, like that's something we share. How we're doing with sexual sin, how we're doing with this or that. Like it should just be part of the culture that we have. That's the sort of thing people share with each other, and that's kind of rough, but like it can be hard. But I think that's really valuable, and I think for like pastors too, and I think for even congregations, uh, for leaders to be able to like ask the pastor um, like how are you doing? And I even talked about this with Pastor David. Like not many congregants just asking like, hey, how are you doing spiritually? Like that's not some congregation members might feel like, oh, I'm not allowed asking the pastor that. Like why? It's like why can't the pastor be asked how are you doing in your spiritual walk? Like what are some of your struggles, like where are you like messing up? Now that's probably asking a little too much. You can probably just start with like, hey, how are you doing, and see where it goes from there. And I think pastors should be asked that once in a while, maybe by like certain other leaders. And then I think certain pastors, like because of the cultural difficulty with like Korean culture especially, pastors should welcome it. um, and so I think that would be one good change we could encourage in our past church structures.
Yeah, and I couple that with what Hayoung said, you know, culture based on relationships.
Yeah.
Like you don't want some just like, I know that you may be a Christian, some like random person, but then I don't have a relationship with you, and you come in and like, hey, how's your spiritual walk? You know, what are your sexual sins? I'm like, I don't know you, man.
Yeah.
Right? So so that community, you know, based on relationship,
Yeah.
that probably is established over time through relational connections, and then which provides the framework or the undergirding of being able to practice accountability, and a deeper level of sharing and stuff like that. So I mean, we were just basically going back to all the stuff that we learned, growing up, right? Like, hey, we need to have these relationships, we need to have this community, we need to be accountable to each other. Oh, so how easy, but how hard.
Yeah.
In a pandemic too.
Ah, seriously.
Add the pandemic. Just
Yeah,
so hard.
yeah.
Um, yeah. One Christian apologist, David Wood, like he said, like he has a very wide following. He actually said, like Ravi got to this point where he couldn't share with anybody like his sins. So he said, so because of that, I'm going to share some of my sins. So he just started like sharing like some of his screw ups and mess up. And I was like, wow, he's really going there. But he said one thing is like after you hear it, like he said, normally when people share their sins, um, when they haven't gone too far, like a lot of and they're sorry about it, like they're repentant, like it's amazing how on the whole people are forgiving to
Mm,
people who will share and open up, but when they don't and they hide it and then it grows and becomes bigger, uh, then that's when it becomes worse, and then you pass this line that Ravi passed at some point.
yeah, yeah.
So
Dang.
yeah, yeah. Well, one more thing to add, I just feel like any discussion does need to like and I'm learning more about this too, like seeing things from the point of the victim, like and how it like affects them when they hear stuff like if you're one of the people that have been abused by Ravi, and then you hear people say, "Well, all sin is sin," like it just kind of like minimizes the damage that's been done to you. And I think we need to remember things like that, or like, um, yeah, or like it wasn't just like, oh yeah, we all have some sexual sin. Like one of my friends pointed out, she works on religious abuse, but one of the things she pointed out is like, I don't think it was just like a sexual desire, sexual appetites issue. Like if that were it, he could have just watched pornography. He could have just like actually like got a consenting, prostitute. But he was doing things that was like manipulating women and like what he if you read the report like the Lorianne Thompson story like this was like an exercise of power, like him using someone for like his own for sexual needs, but it was more than sexual needs, sexual desires, but it was more than that. And so I think like recognizing that, yeah, this was more than just sexual sin. It was like sexual predation, and like and for women to hear that, like, yeah, this was like really bad. It's not like, yeah, any of us can sin, but not any of us will be a sexual predator over years of time. Like, um, so
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. There's so many layers
yeah,
that are being uncovered, and in reflection upon like ourselves as individual Christians, upon the church as an institution, upon leadership structures or organizational structures. So definitely going forward in the next like weeks and months, maybe years, hopefully like better changes can come about, like you mentioned earlier about organizations re-examining themselves and stuff like that. Yeah, we could definitely continue this conversation in the near future again, as more things come to light or more developments occur.